Hello and happy Culture Night. My name is Browne and I'm working with the Museum of Childhood Ireland in community engagement. And my job is to collect stories, memories and anecdotes of growing up with Irish connections both home and abroad. The topic we've been discussing this Culture Night at the Museum of Childhood Ireland is learning from the past, why the history of childhood and youth matters. And this is a really, really big, important question, and there are no shortage of answers. And I can only answer this from my own perspective, and that is why a museum that celebrates the history of childhood is so important to me, and that is, at its core, in short, representation. So there are so many valid topics being discussed this week, such as the relevance of history with regards to the present, what lessons we can learn from the past in order to inform the future, and whether history is only relevant if it relates to the now or teaches us a lesson, which again is another very big question. But I myself would like to focus on something a lot more simple, perhaps more emotionally based than academic, but it is an integral topic to me, and it's the reason why I am so grateful to have the opportunity to work with an organisation such as the Museum of Childhood. So you've heard the old saying, history is written by the victors, and that is so inherently true. So when we learn about history, when we read history books, it's rife with tales of knights, of kings, of queens, of really, really important people in society, with very little focus on the everyday people and just what life was actually like. And it is true that social history is becoming all the more popular, and I have noticed this in my own research in art history, with scholars seeking to explore the lives of bygone societies in order to inform kind of a more authentic reading of the literary or artistic output, to see what it actually meant at the time. However, the field is very, very much still in its infancy, and the vast majority of material still tends to encompass the elite rather than the everyday person. So this is why I feel that the history of childhood and youth matters so much. It is the one great leveler. No matter who you are or where you come from, we all experience childhood. And yes, our childhoods vary greatly depending on a number of factors, where we grew up, how we grew up. However, we've all gone through this, or maybe we're currently in its throes at the moment. And that brings us all together, I think. So by focusing on the history of youth and childhood, we can all relate to each other. We can become closer, we can engage with our cultures and our heritage and our upbringings through their rich variety, both shared experiences and unique experiences that are maybe we've experienced and somebody else hasn't. So we're taking this week to think about what we can learn from the past, but I would like to take a slightly different slant on this and talk more simply about what we can learn from each other, what we can learn from each other in the past, what we can learn from each other now, and what we can learn from each other in the future as well. So a museum like the Museum of Childhood, which seeks to create a cultural experience which exemplifies and reflects the shared experience of those who grew up in Ireland and those with Irish connections or roots abroad, is also unbelievably unique and unbelievably important. I myself have often spoke about how culture can be really inaccessible, how elitism, both academic and economic, can alienate certain groups of society from and make them less likely to engage with our heritage organizations. However, I truly believe that a museum like this one can effectively shatter that barrier, which is really, really exciting. So at its core, a museum of this type, or any museum that takes into account the history of childhood and youth, is driven by the community. So I have the absolute pleasure of working on the community engagement project, which means that I'm facilitating this. So we're hearing stories with no caveats. We're collecting the lives of those around us. We want to reminisce on the good, but also on the bad, and look at what it means to be human and connected. And that is the one thing that I have noticed about being Irish or having Irish connections from living abroad. For many years, I've lived in both Italy and Scotland, but we always want that connection as Irish people. So I always say that if you leave two people who grew up in Ireland or who have any kind of Irish connection, whether they grew up home or abroad, if you put us in a room together, I always say that within 5 minutes and 10 questions, we have found our mutual connection, someone that we both know, some place we've both been, some event we both went to at the same time. We have a very human need to connect, and I do think that that's what this museum does. So furthermore, returning to the integral concept of representation, the history of childhood matters so much, and it needs to be focused on, as it is the first chance that we get to encourage children to engage with culture. So I still remember my first trip to a museum as a child when I was younger. I think it was the W5 Museum in Belfast. My granny brought me up for the day. And it was an incredible experience because it too caters for children and presents learning and culture in a very fun and accessible environment. So I think this kind of idea of making science fun can be carried across into our history museums. And that's why we should focus on the history of childhood and youth. So there are definitely wonderful, wonderful events being run across all of our state museums for children. And I have had the pleasure of experiencing some of these and helping out with them. And that's been wonderful. But what this builds on is why it is so integral. So when a small child walks into a museum, kind of being bombarded with a lot of material that they have not yet learned or never, I suppose, experienced or never, interacted with, it can be quite overwhelming. So you've got, again, the aforementioned tales of knights and kings and queens of times gone by. Sometimes that can seem more fairy tale than real. So, and sometimes you can wonder, is this really for me? Where do I fit into this story? Like, where is my part here? Like this, I'm not in this story. Like this story has nothing to do with me. It's sort of just something that you hear about, which can be hard to kind of process as a child as well. But what a museum that would focus on the history of child and youth would be directly reflect that which is familiar to them in their own lives and kind of like a mirror to their own experience. So a toy is a toy, no matter what era it comes from. A school is school, no matter when you've been. Family photos, shared games, and other items and stories. These are all universally recognized. And just imagine how magical it is to walk into a museum that celebrates experiences or objects that are really close to your own life. So you feel that your story is just as valid, that you are part of history. And this creates a huge sense of inclusion, I think, in our youth. And it gives them a secure and comfortable basis in a museum type setting. So this means that as they grow up, they will never question whether they're allowed to be in a cultural institution. They'll never question whether it's a normal thing to just go and visit on a weekend, because it will be for them. So it's really, really wonderful. And it's this one seemingly small act of focusing on the history of childhood or the history of youth can create a much more diverse, open and accessible cultural landscape. And indeed going forward as well, if we bring people in and show them their own experiences and let them have their say and how they want their museums to be run, how they want their stories to be reflected back at them, then down the line we're going to have a much more diverse and inclusive cultural sort of landscape in all of our museums and in all of our state and private organizations, which is really, really exciting. So the same goes for those, not just children, but those who are engaging with the history of youth in their later years, who then see their own childhood reflected back at them, that kind of nostalgia of looking through memories. So there is no age limit on inclusion. And this too is a wonderful experience to see your own life being reflected back at you as something that is important, valid, noteworthy and special. And all of our experiences and lives are indeed so special. And if I may borrow another saying, it takes a village. And it takes a wide and diverse group of people to make a community. And there is as much beauty and importance in our shared experiences as there is in our differences and what sets us apart. History is fascinating, and the big events certainly deserve their spotlight, don't get me wrong. But these big events cannot occur without multitudes of little events and seemingly trivial experiences that hold them up and make part of the human experience. So by focusing on the history of childhood and youth, we're not only inspiring the next generation to connect more authentically with culture on a more personal level, to connect more with history and with heritage, we're creating a more thoughtfully diverse cultural landscape, bringing people from all walks of life together and sharing our experiences towards a common goal. And that is something that's very special indeed, engaging with history less as a story and more as a shared lived experience. Even if we weren't alive back then, we have a multitude of source material from people who were. And when we look at that source material, then if we apply it to our own lives and look at our own experiences, it can help us not just learn it, not just read it, but actually live it, understand it, and be more, I suppose, thoughtful and involved while we are engaging with history, which I think is incredibly important. And that's the aim of the museum, I believe, as well. And we look forward to this engagement with everybody across a multitude of events in the coming months. And we'd love to hear your stories and your experiences about your own childhood no matter how small. We love to hear about your own children. So if you'd like to join in, please get in touch with us at community@museumofchildhood.ie to join in with our community engagement programs, to share with us your own childhood or stories from your own children now. I so look forward to hearing you all, and I wish you an absolutely amazing Culture Night 2022. Thank you so much. Goodbye.